Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's session for the First Responder and Veteran Wellbeing Summit. It's lovely to have you here, and I'm absolutely delighted to have Erin online and looking forward to, I'm sure, what will be an incredibly valuable and insightful presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and play, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. We recognise your deep connection to the land, water, culture, and importantly, community, and honour your contribution across generations. Couple of big quick notes just before I introduce Erin and we get underway is that firstly, today's session will be recorded, and we'll make that available in the coming days to all registered participants via our two websites, both the First Responder wellbeingsummit.com.au as well as our wellbeingaustralia.com.au websites. Erin may set aside a few minutes at the end. Hopefully we'll get to have a few questions. If you would like to pose a question to Erin, please put that in the click on the Q&A button. And if you wouldn't mind typing your question in there, we'll make sure that we see that towards the end, and hopefully we'll get to answer all those questions. Also, we'd love your feedback on the session today. So at the end, when you log off, and exit this webinar, there'll be a very short 1 to 2 minute survey. And if you wouldn't mind, please just taking the time to fill that in. We really do appreciate it. And lastly, we've developed some excellent free wellbeing resources coming out of this summit, and that will build on the themes of this summit. And these will be sent to your inbox in the coming weeks. So please make sure that Wellbeing Australia is listed as a sender for you, and so that they don't end up in your junk folder. Wonderful. Well, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Erin Smith. Erin's an associate professor at La Trobe University, and she's also the discipline lead for paramedicine there. And recently has been appointed as director to the Violet Vines Marshman Centre for Rural Health Research. She's also a national leader in first responder mental health and wellbeing. Erin brings decades of research and global engagement and deep insights into what it takes to proactively manage your well-being and roles that are involved with repeat exposure to trauma. In this session, Before It Hurts, Erin will explore the early warning signs and the role of important family and peers in supporting individuals, and how workplaces can create proactive cultures of care. Good afternoon, Erin.
Hi, Donna. Thank you so much for having me. I will just start sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see that at that end, Donna? Is that fine?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that lovely welcome. And I would just like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the beautiful lands and waters on which we come together today. And I also pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present. I absolutely appreciate the ancient connection that they hold with their country. So in today's presentation, I'm going to condense or attempt to condense what I've learned from over 25 years of both professional and personal experience about supporting frontline worker mental health. So I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of a summary, and even though I am an academic, I'm going to try not to go too far down into that academic presentation mode, but I will share with you what I have learned from my own experience and also what the evidence does tell us as well. I'm also then going to talk about how we can best support ourselves as people working on the front lines, and how can we support our colleagues. I'm also then going to touch on how our family members can help provide support, but also perhaps even more importantly, how we can help them because they are absolutely living alongside a lot of the trauma exposure and mental health challenges that our first responders and frontline workers are living with. And then finally, I'm going to touch on how frontline organisations can best support first responders, defence personnel and veterans. And hopefully I'll have some time left over for some questions. But at the end, I have provided my contact details, and I'm very happy to follow up with anyone after the session. So one thing I want to really highlight at the beginning of this session, because it underlines everything that I'm going to be talking about, is that no matter what kind of frontline role we're working in, we are inevitably going to be exposed to trauma through that role. Now, that could be direct trauma exposure. So we might physically be there and witness a devastating event. We might be on the front lines and see a car crash, or as part of war and conflict, we might see that violence and conflict around us. Increasingly, we are also going to be indirectly or vicariously exposed to trauma as well. And that's basically going to occur anytime we empathetically engage with the suffering of others. And I know my own psychologist probably defined it the best for me when I was experiencing vicarious trauma myself. And he said it's the cost of bearing witness to other people's suffering. So I'm sure all of us listening today, and anyone who might listen to this recording, has probably experienced trauma vicariously and maybe not even been aware of it. I know it was certainly something that I wasn't aware of when I was in the middle of my vicarious traumatization. I also want to highlight that in the roles that we're doing, whether they are paid career roles or volunteer roles, even if we are now retired and veterans, we've probably experienced cumulative trauma exposure. So it might not just be the one big event that's traumatic. It could very likely be a cumulative result of being exposed to many, many smaller traumatic events throughout the course of our career. And we will not know which one of those individual events, or whether it's the accumulation of all of those events combined, may potentially then impact our mental health. We now know more about this concept of moral injury, and I know Mark Layson is going to be talking about that on Thursday, I believe, later in the program. So that will be a fantastic session to join into. So I'm not going to cover moral injury in my session today, only to identify that it is something we are becoming increasingly aware of. I think one key thing I would love for you all to take away from this session is how our roles on the front line impact us when it comes to trauma exposure. And there are three key ways that we are going to respond to the trauma that we are exposed to through our work. And they are in bio, psycho, social ways. So biologically, we have a physiological response when we are exposed to something traumatic. Our brains are primarily protective mechanisms, and buried deep down into a part of our brain called the amygdala is something I like to think of as almost like a car alarm. And whenever it senses any kind of danger going off around us, it will set off an alarm. We might not be aware of that at all. We might not actually recognize that that alarm is going off in our brain, but our brain has gone into that primal protective mode. And when it does that, it sets off a cascade of hormonal responses. So our adrenaline levels go up, our cortisol levels go up, our heart rate might go up. We might find ourselves feeling a bit sweaty or clammy. These are all biological responses that we might have when we experience something traumatic. We may also experience a range of psychological responses. We might feel anxious. We might start having problems with our relationships and the way that we interact with people. We might feel more jittery, on edge. We might start avoiding things like key dates or reminders or locations because it reminds us of that traumatic experience. And then we'll have a range of social reactions as well. We might start to engage in maladaptive coping behaviours. Maybe we start to drink a little bit more. Maybe there's recreational drug use. Maybe we engage in risk-taking behaviours that we wouldn't usually do, or maybe in a greater way. Maybe we disconnect from things that are healthy and disengage from people that generally provide support to us. And I want to reiterate that all of these are normal. These are normal ways that we respond biologically, psychologically, and socially to the trauma that is inherently associated with the job that we do on the front line. But what I would also like to highlight is that by being exposed to this trauma and having these normal responses doesn't necessarily mean that we were going to end up with poorer mental health. If we get better at recognizing these signs and symptoms earlier and put protective mechanisms in place, we can absolutely limit the potential impact on our mental health going forward. And one thing I think really resonates with me is sort of being mindful of the time frame that these responses are likely to occur for in a normal reaction. And generally, if we've experienced something traumatic, for a number of weeks after that event, we can experience these normal biopsychosocial responses. But I think if it goes on much more than a month into a couple of months and you're still experiencing problems sleeping, having nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, any of those biopsychosocial responses, that's when it's probably time to reach out and have a chat with either a loved one or a peer, a colleague, or a mental health professional. So, what have I actually learned around how we best support those of us who have been exposed to trauma throughout our roles? Firstly, the biggest thing that I have learned, both myself personally and through the evidence out there, is that support strategies need to be both proactive and reactive. Now, I believe that most organisations out there, most emergency service and defence organisations out there are very good at being reactive. If they know someone has been exposed to trauma or been involved in a traumatic event, there are a range of resources available. Most likely they'll have an employee assistance program, some kind of mental health program that employees can reach out to and use. But again, it tends to be quite reactive and relies on the person themselves to seek help. I think we need to be much better from an individual level and also an organisational level at being more proactive and preventive in the way that we provide support. And I'm going to touch on that in a little bit more detail. I absolutely believe that strategies for supporting our well-being need to be implemented early in our careers. So I teach paramedic students now at La Trobe University, and I make sure that we're talking about the importance of protecting their well-being as undergraduate students. I think it's never too early to start talking about well-being and embedding those really important routines early in the career that are then reinforced throughout the career and really importantly into retirement. Some of the people that I have worked with and helped in terms of peer support that have been the most profoundly impacted in terms of mental health and well-being are those that have retired from their role, and particularly those that were forced into early retirement because of ill health and mental ill health. There's that real loss of identity and a whole host of issues that comes with that. So I think we cannot neglect wellbeing support once people retire. So we need to have systems in place that allow for people who've retired to still be supported in terms of their retirement. One size does not fit all. Now, if anyone listening has had to utilize an employee wellbeing program, for example, I know I've done so on several occasions, and while they absolutely play a really important role, I believe if that's the only opportunity to provide support through an organisation, then we're failing. We need to have a more holistic range of support services that are going to meet the needs of a very diverse workforce across a range of frontline roles. So I'm talking here about pastoral care, spiritual care, peer support, psychological support. Ambulance Victoria have an incredible peer dog program, and I know a number of other organisations are using animals in terms of support as well. But I think it's really important, and the evidence supports this, that you need to have a range of support strategies in place, because you might need something different depending on the circumstance and what you actually need to get out of that support service at the time. I'm a huge advocate for the sharing of lived experience. I have accessed peer support myself, and I am an active peer supporter across a range of organisations. And I think it's one of the most important ways that we can support people who are going through traumatic experiences to support their well-being. And absolutely, we need programs that address self-stigmatization. So I think we understand that stigma is a huge issue for frontline responders in seeking help, but really the evidence, and definitely the big Beyond Blue program of research that came out, I think 2018 now, that looked at some over 20,000 first responders across Australia, identified that the way we stigmatize ourselves is actually what's inhibiting help-seeking behaviours. So I'm now briefly going to go through supporting ourselves and supporting our colleagues. And in terms of self-care, this shouldn't be new to anybody that's listening. I'm sure hopefully all of you are making this ongoing commitment to yourself through having a self-care plan in place and actually putting it into practice. And I know I need to practice what I preach sometimes. We can get very busy and sometimes the self-care routine can drop off. There is no absolute formula for self-care. It should be unique, and it probably will change over time depending on what you're experiencing and what's working for you at that moment. But ultimately, I think it's really about finding activities that work best for you, but really making sure that you are doing a range of activities that go across the spectrum of temporary and enduring self-care. So what I mean by that is temporary, absolutely go and have a great piece of chocolate cake with a friend and have a little bit of a chat. That's a great temporary form of self-care. But we also need to be embedding practices into our routine that are more enduring. So I'm talking here about maybe mindfulness, yoga, meditation, journaling, things that we can do over time that will build up our resilience as we go. And just to touch on 3 domains of self-care that are really important for us to look at, we need to be looking after our emotions, our own psychological self-care. That can be as simple as saying no to things that might be causing unnecessary stress, or setting up some kind of routine connection with a friend or a colleague to have a chat. Our physical self-care, never underestimate the impact of having a great night's sleep or having a routine for our physical activity. And we often neglect our spiritual self-care. Now, that might be something like attending a religious service, but for others, it might be spending time in nature or incorporating regular acts of kindness into your day. For me, I found keeping a gratitude journal is a really helpful way, and I do this at night time before I go to sleep. I either physically write down in a journal or I will just, it's a bit of a mantra that I recite to myself. What am I grateful for today? And maybe they're little things like having a warm bed with an electric blanket to curl up to with my 2 little pugs at the end of a cold day. But it lets your brain, it's a signal to your brain if you are in that traumatic response, if you are in fight or flight. It's a way to tell your brain, I can relax now, I can exhale, I can lower my arousal levels, and that's where the true restoration and relaxation comes. I'm not going to read through all of these. Donna, I'm sure we're actually going to provide copies of these slides to anyone, but I am, if you are interested, you can reach out to me afterwards and I can send these through. But just to show you that there are a range of evidence-based self-care apps. These are all free to use, and I have tried all of these myself. And depending on what you're looking for, there's a whole range of things here that you might find really useful. So how can we support our colleagues? I'm, as I said, a real advocate for peer support, and there are lots and lots of models out there to do this. What I'm going to focus on in today's session is one that I've had a lot of experience with, particularly through my time as an emergency responder with the Red Cross, and that's something that we call psychological first aid. The reason I love this is that anybody can do it. We can do it anywhere. And it really helps us to help our colleagues feel safe, connected, and in control. But perhaps most importantly, it's about empowering them to identify their own needs and identify some appropriate sources of support. So I'm going to go through very briefly the Red Cross model for that. But just to touch on how it is different to counselling, it's not traditional psychiatric or professional mental health treatment, but a conversation, a strategy to help reduce any stress reactions we might be going through. We don't have to have training or a degree to use it, but there is great training available online to help us build those conversational skills. And if you are interested, there are a range of training opportunities online. And as I mentioned, the beauty of this is you can use it in any setting. So you could use it at work, you can use it at a friend's house, at the coffee shop, wherever you can sit down and have a conversation. So very quickly, the method that we use through the Red Cross is called Look, Listen, Link. And I've got a full reference to this at the end for anyone who would like to look at it in more detail. But essentially, the first part of it is coming back to that biopsychosocial response. Can we identify in our colleagues if they are struggling? Maybe there are biological telltales. Maybe we can see that they just aren't themselves, that they're jittery, that they're on edge. Maybe they're a bit sweaty, or you can tell they haven't been sleeping. Maybe there are other psychological or social signs that you have noticed. That's the first part, is identifying colleagues who might need our support. The second part is then listening to them. And so considering how you would actually approach that colleague, ask them if they're okay, if they need support, how to listen actively to their concerns and what's going on with them, and then empowering them to identify their needs. The purpose of psychological first aid isn't to be a counsellor. It's not to solve their problems for them. It's to get them thinking about what are the key needs that they have at the moment, and what are the ways that they could actually meet those needs in terms of help. And so the final part of that is then linking them with a range of information and support services that you think would be helpful to them. So that, in a really short period of time, in a nutshell, there is Look, Listen, Link, a really great way to support our colleagues. And there's the full reference on it for anyone who might be more interested. What can our families do? So we know, and I know firsthand, my husband was the first person to recognize that I was struggling with vicarious trauma. And when I was ultimately diagnosed with PTSD and I went through the signs and symptoms that I had been experiencing, he recognized all of them before I even did. So I think it's really important to understand that range of biopsychosocial responses that our loved ones might be having to trauma. But more importantly, for anyone listening who is a family member, you need to look after yourself first. It's that old anecdote that we share and we hear whenever we get on a plane. You need to put on your own oxygen mask first before you can help anybody else. So recognizing that it is very stressful living alongside frontline workers, particularly frontline workers who have been traumatized and are living with mental health challenges like PTSD. It's really important to know where you can access a range of great support resources for you. One example, and there are many out there, but the Code 9 Foundation here in Australia is brilliant. They offer a private online support group for family members of first responders. And in the past, I've been involved in moderating that group. And it's a really fantastic way to build a community of support, to feel connected and to share insights and just know that you're not alone. And they've also fairly recently published this fantastic book which helps explain PTSD to children of frontline workers. So absolutely jump onto their website and have a look at the range of resources that they can provide for you. And finally, what can organisations do? I touched on this right at the beginning, but I think one of the most important things that I have learned through my work over the past few decades is that organisations need to get better at reaching in to people who might be struggling. We cannot expect people who are in a crisis to reach out. And this was absolutely my own personal experience as well. When I was in an absolute black hole and right in the middle of my PTSD, I could barely get out of bed and have a shower some mornings, let alone reach out to a stranger at the end of an employee assistance program call line. But the few people that took the time to reach into me and didn't necessarily expect anything. It was just, sometimes it might just be a text message just to let me know they were thinking of me. Maybe it's something practical in terms of dropping off some food, or if you've got kids, is there anything I can do to help with the kids? But organisations need to have systems in place that get better at reaching in and identifying people who are struggling rather than expecting them to reach out and ask for help. I've touched on this as well, but we absolutely need, from an organisational perspective, to be providing a range of support options that are going to meet the very different needs of a diverse community of responders. I might love speaking to a psychologist, but someone else might much prefer to speak to a religious leader. Other people might prefer peer support over an individual one-on-one chat. You need to have that range of options available. And absolutely, as I mentioned, we need to have programs and policies in place that are addressing stigmatization, and particularly that self-stigmatization that we do to ourselves, in order to increase help-seeking behaviours. And finally, I think it is really important to be providing mental health literacy training to anyone working in management and leadership positions. We need to be equipping our managers and leaders with the skills to identify people who might be struggling, identifying those biopsychosocial signs that people might be exhibiting because they have been traumatized and need wellbeing support, providing them with the skills to reach out safely and confidently to these people and have important, potentially life-saving and career-saving conversations with them around mental health and wellbeing. So thank you all so much. I know that that was a lot to get through in half an hour. I'm more than happy to take any questions that anybody might have, and I've got my contact details there on the screen if anybody would like to follow up afterwards as well. But Donna, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you all today.
Oh, thank you so much, Erin. There was so much packed into that presentation in terms of valuable resources, ideas, practical advice and suggestions. And I think speaking about your own personal experience just brings it to life so much. So thank you for that vulnerability and for sharing your own personal story, not just as a researcher and an expert in this space, but also your own personal experience. One question I have for you, Erin, quickly is what are some of the early warning signs that people, or their loved ones for that matter, may often miss when their one's well-being is about starting to suffer?
It's a great question, Donna. And if I may go back to my own personal experience as well, the things that I missed and my family probably missed, and now looking back with hindsight and the benefit of knowledge and understanding now, it can be little things, changes in mood, changes in behavior, changes in your regular pattern. So if you are somebody who generally goes for a walk every day with the dogs and all of a sudden you notice that you can't be bothered, or your loved one might notice that you can't be bothered. For me, I became particularly disengaged with family and friends, things that used to bring me joy. I just couldn't bring myself to find the energy to be involved with. Even things like going out for meals, I would find myself constantly finding excuses to cancel on friends and loved ones. My sleeping habits were one of the biggest warning signs for me. I started having very disrupted sleep. I was having very horrific nightmares that would take me back to particular jobs or particular stories that people had shared with me that were quite traumatic, to the point where in my nightmares it was me that was, for example, I did a lot of work with first responders after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and was very privileged over a 2-decade period to be witness to many of their stories of survival. But hearing that impacts our brain in ways that I did not comprehend when I was younger and when I was doing that work. And so I started having nightmares where it was myself buried under the rubble, where I couldn't breathe. And my husband would have to wake me because I was thrashing around under the sheets, because in my nightmare I was trying to escape. I would have intrusive thoughts. I would avoid dates. I avoided public transport. All these little things that when I look at them in isolation didn't mean much, but when I started putting them together as a pattern of change of behavior, absolutely were telltale signs that I wasn't listening to. Now I am much better at looking for and recognizing those warning signs. So if my sleep starts to get disrupted, if I can notice changes in my mood, if I become particularly irritable or anxious, if I start avoiding those things that usually give me pleasure and joy, to me, that's the little warning. And my husband and family now know, and they're now confident enough to say to me, "Are you okay? We've noticed XYZ." And I think maybe that's one takeaway for me to share with everybody. Don't be afraid to be honest. Clarity is kind. I have noticed that you're not coping at the moment. I have noticed that, like my husband says to me, you've been in your PJs for the past 2 days. Is everything okay? Those little things that maybe we used to tiptoe around or avoid, and that's absolutely stealing that, I should say. I'm absolutely stealing that from Brene Brown. Kindness or clarity is kindness, or I'm probably not quoting her correctly. But yes, don't be afraid to be honest about what you're seeing in your loved ones.
Wonderful. Well, such valuable insight. Thank you, Erin. And thank you all so much for joining us for this session. A big thank you to you, Erin, for sharing such valuable insights and your personal experiences, as I said before. Before we close, we just want to remind you that if anything raised in today's session has brought up any difficult feelings for you, please know that you're not alone and that support is available. I'll leave a slide on the screen for a moment at the end of the session with some mental health and crisis support services in case you or somebody you know or love needs them. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of today's session will be available shortly on both the wellbeingaustralia.com.au website as well as First Responder Wellbeing Summit, all one word, .com.au. On behalf of the team at Wellbeing Australia and Erin, thank you again for being part of the 2025 First Responder and Veterans Wellbeing Summit, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thank you all.